Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Let's make sure I got the share. Yeah, there it is. And we are on to the second plague. Yay. And at this point, they've warned Pharaoh about the second plague, which is, of course, the frogs. And now we have the actual implementation of the plague. Vayet Aharon et yado, Aaron stretched his hand, al meimei Mitzrayim, over the waters of Egypt. Vatal hatzvardea, and the frog, this is interesting, and Rashi's going to comment on this. It's singular, because tzvardeim, here's the word in plural, tzvardeim, here's the word in the singular, vatal hatzvardea, and the frog came up, vatachas et eretz Mitzrayim, and it covered the land of Egypt. Let's go on to here we are. Find the place here. Here, Vatal Hatzvardea, and the frog came up. And in Shmot Rabbah, in Exodus, the Midrash, the great Midrash on Exodus, it comments on this word, because anything like this is going to jump out. He says, Tzvardea achat haita. There was one frog to begin with. Vahayu makin ota, and they struck this frog. Vehi matezet nechilim, and it would spew out swarms and swarms. Zehu midrasho, and Rashi tells us this is a midrashic interpretation. We'll talk about that in a second. Try and puzzle that out. Upshuto, but the simple meaning, it's not a big mystery, he says. Yesh lomar, one can say, shrutz hatzvardaim. That is to say that when we talk about the swarm of the frogs, Koreh Lashon Yechidot. I'm going to think Yechidot maybe. That's sometimes the printing is so hard to read, right? One calls it by the singular. In other words, I think he's saying that it's referring to the swarm of frogs, and the swarm is singular, and so it's called frog. And we do that. We do that in English too, where we sometimes use the singular to describe an entire number of things, sort of thinking of it more as an entity. V'chein, and he says there are other examples coming up very soon. Vatihi hakinam, right? And it says there it is in the Torah. It says, and the flea, right? As opposed to kinim, which would be fleas. So that was one of the plagues. And there it's talking about flea, the swarms, as you can imagine, of fleas. Harechisha gedolira. So he's got some kind of hirchisha, would be to croak, is apparently the French word here. I got that from Safaria. That's how they translate it. Okay. I think they use a different word, but I believe he's referring to the croaking of the frogs, balaz in Old French. Va'af va'tal hatzvardeya, okay, and even the frog came up. He says, well, what's a tzvardeya? It doesn't sound like an initially Hebrew word, notice, right? So it's because of all these letters that are part of it. So he says, and I believe it's the modern French word as well, which is grenouille, something like that, which means frogs, right? And apparently this is the Yiddish, gefresh, must be the Yiddish word for frog. I'm not familiar with it. So, well, let's go back to why would it want to talk about it that way, possibly, or why does the Midrash take it that way? I think that the idea is that sometimes the whole little part that they added about trying to get rid of it, and as a result they had even more. And I think that's what it was trying to say. The Midrash was trying to say that when God decided to send this plague against Egypt, there was really not much they could do about it. And in fact, their efforts were to the extent of, and we've all had that experience, where the solution becomes part of the problem as well. And that's what's going on here. That certainly would apply to one frog, smacking the frog to get rid of it, and now having swarms of frogs as a result. So this is also part of human experience, I believe. Going on. Vayasu chen hachartumim belatehem. Right, so the sorcerers did similarly. They did the same trick, right, with their magic. Vaya'alu et hatzfardeim al eretz Mitzrayim. This sounds like it's saying that they also, well, what do you know? So that was a good thing, good trick for them to do, right? To bring more frogs on the land of Egypt. Wow, that's really using it. Okay. Vayikra, sometimes I wonder if this is a tiny little example of biblical humor. Not too much humor in this, right? Vayikra Pharaoh Moshe ula Aaron, and Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron, Vayomer, and he said to them, Ha'atiru el Hashem, plead to God, please plead to God. And this word ha'atiru, it's a synonym for prayer. And it comes from a word eter, which means, and I think it's referred to an ox goad, something like that. In other words, you'd use an ox goad to direct the ox. And I think that's the origin of this word, and the idea of trying to use one's prayer to change the direction of something. And I think that's a specific kind of prayer. And Rashi's going to comment on the kind of prayer that we're talking about. Vayaser hatzfardaim. So this is Pharaoh telling them, and let him, right, that he may remove the frogs, mimeni, from me, ume'ami, and from my people. Va'ashalcha et ha'am. Right, we're already on to the second plague, and look at this. He's saying, I'm going to send the people, and let them offer up to God. They can do it. I'm ready to do it. It's just too much. Just get rid of it, and I'm going to cooperate on the second plague. Well, we know the future of that one. So going on, let's see here. Vayomer Moshe leFaro. Moses says to Pharaoh, Itpa'er alai, have glory over me. In other words, he's saying, you'll see. What do we mean by this? Lamatai a'atir lacha. At what point in time, for what point in time should I pray for you? It's not saying when should I pray, and Rashi's going to clarify this, right? For what point in time should I pray for you? V'la avadecha, and for your servants, v'la amcha, and for your people, lahachrit hatzfardaim, to get rid of, right, to annihilate the frogs. Now, this is a context, seeing the context of this word clarifies for us the meaning of this word, which means, in other words, to get rid of them, And there is a punishment called karet. And sometimes this word is translated as to cut off. And this punishment, it's a divine punishment called karet. And it's sometimes translated with this fancy word called excision. But I believe it's there is not a clear explanation of what it's talking about, but one of the meanings I wonder to myself is oblivion. In other words, there's certain sins that if one commits them, the punishment in the Torah is karet. And there's even a tractate called Kritut, which describes and probably lists all the punishments that have this divine punishment as a consequence. And I think to myself that possibly it refers to the idea of oblivion. And sadly, I think one of the reasons why people aren't so religious, etc., has to do with the fact that we don't really believe there's anything beyond this life, that all there is this life, and frankly, it's of course so brief, and we have so little control. And I think that if we were to analyze, that notion of disbelief in anything beyond, you have to have really very strong moral sense, not to sort of say, well, in that case, I'm sort of in it for me. But having said that, I want you to know that even this threat of oblivion is avoidable through tshuva. Tshuva is such, that is, of course, we know repentance, right? Return. That any time in your life, while you're alive, if you decide to change direction, assuming you're on a path of hachrata, if you're in the path that sort of leads to oblivion, you are able to change it. It isn't necessarily easy, but nevertheless, it isn't an absolute. So going back into the context of the sentence that we're actually reading, Pharaoh is asking them to cut off the frogs. And of course, Moses is saying that I'm going to give you, Pharaoh, the ability to tell me at what point you want those frogs cut off. I'll pray, and you just tell me exactly when we should do that. Mimcha, from you, umibatecha, and from your home. Rak bayaor tisha arna. So they aren't going to be completely cut off. They are going to remain tisha arna. They're going to remain in the Nile. That's where they're going to stay. Rashi, hit pa'er alai. You literally, from pa'er meaning glory, something like that, have the glory over me. But it's said in a little bit of an ironic sense. But Rashi's going to explain the use of this hit pa'el form, hit pa'er. He says, Kamosh Yeshayahu, we find a similar expression in the 10th chapter of Isaiah, hit pa'er hagarzin al hachotzev bo. Right. Ha yit pa'er. Shall the axe glorify over the one who hews with it? Right. Mishtabeach lomar. Should the axe pride itself, right? Praise itself to say, Ani gadol mimcha, I am greater than you. And I'm not certain of the context that Isaiah is using this, but is it possible that he's talking about if in fact if enemies of the Israelites come to attack them and are successful, it's only because God is the one. They are, in a sense, the axe, but who is the one who uses the axe? And Isaiah is saying, since when does the axe say, I have more power and more control over the one who's actually wielding the axe? And I think this is yeah.
I heard once, God takes care of everything, but
Yes.
bring a shovel.
Yes. He still uses an axe. He still uses an axe.
Yes,
Yes. So, but behind it is nevertheless. I mean, that I believe is a way of describing transcendency. In other words, I may think, I may devise, but who gives me the ability to think and devise? Who's the one? Where does that come from? And that's the essential sort of biblical position, I'm saying it doesn't end there, and it doesn't start there. It starts with something beyond. This looks like a modern English word, right? But I mean, it's French, right? Perhaps vanter, but to vaunt, right? That's exactly what we're talking about. That's the English word. When you vaunt over someone, that's what we're describing here. Right? V'chein hitpa'er alai. So here, in this context, with Moses saying to Pharaoh, I'm going to let you vaunt over me. Hishtabeach hitchakem. Okay, you can have this control, right? To be able to plot or velishol and to ask davar gadol. So you can really show your smartness, chacham, right? And to ask for something that's a pretty amazing thing, velomar, and to say, and you can think shelo uchal la'asoto, that I wouldn't be able to do that, right? I mean, consider for a moment. Moses is saying to Pharaoh, you determine the time. You tell me what time I should pray for the frogs to get removed. Sounds pretty phenomenal. But again, one of the things, perhaps even the most important thing, that beyond the punishment factor of these plagues is that the real purpose of it is to try and wake up the Egyptians that in fact God exists, that there is some transcendent power to whom we are all accountable to. And that, by the way, wasn't just to the Egyptians. It was also to the Israelites. It was to everyone who was experiencing that to recognize and to be convinced that there is something greater. So this would be a little proof too, right? That Moses had the power that to pray to God and for this horrible situation to be remedied. So he's explaining here, Lama atir lach, lamatai atir lacha. For what time should I pray for you, right? Should I plead for you? So this could be understood in a different way, and Rashi wants to make sure we don't make the mistake that Moses is saying, well, when do you want me to pray for you? Do you want me to pray for you now? Do you want me to pray for you tomorrow? That isn't the question. The question is about the prayer itself being at what time these frogs should be removed. Et asher atir lacha, right? That which I will pray for you, hayom, because I'm going to pray today, right? Regardless, Moses is saying to Pharaoh, I'm going to pray today, al hachratat hatzvardaim, regarding the removal of the frogs, lematai tirtzeh, sheyikartu. At what point you want, tirtzeh, you want, sheyikartu, that they should be removed. The tir'eh, and you're going to see, im ashlim dvarai, okay, if I'm going to make good my words, lemoed shetikbali, at the appointed time that you appoint for me, that you set for me. Now he's explaining why we're going to translate it that way. And Rashi says, Ilu ne'emar matai a'atir, had Moses not said lematai, right? For what time do you want them to be removed? If he had just said, when should I pray? Hayam mashma, it would imply matai et palel. It would have implied, at what point do you want me to pray? Achshav shene'emar lematai, but because the Hebrew says lematai, as to when, mashma ani hayom, the implication is ani hayom et palel, I'm going to pray today, alecha, on your behalf, sheyikartu hatzvardaim, that the frogs should be cut off, they should be removed, lazman shetikbali, at the point in time that you set for me. Emor le'eze yom tirtzeh, or amor le'eze yom, emor le'eze yom tirtzeh. Say at which day, on which day you want, shi'ikartu, that they should be removed. Atir, and that's that's the point where I'm going to, for what I'm going to pray. Atiru ve'etarti. Okay, it says, sorry, forgive me. It says period, yikartu. Atir, he'etiru ve'etarti. Okay, it says it uses this form, okay. This is a hifil form, and it velo ne'emar etar. Okay, it doesn't say, it says atir, not etar. Atru atarti. This is a different form of the verb. Okay, mipnei. Why does it use this hifil form, this causative form? Mipnei shekol lashon eter. He says the reason why is that when it refers to this term of praying, harbut, okay, I think it's saying palal hu, okay, it says palel, from hit palel, right? It has to do with a great deal of praying, of entreating. V'ka'asher yomar harbu arbe hirbeti. So again, this is using this particular form of the verb, right? Multiply, I will make great, I made great, something like that. Lashon hif'il. This is a causative. I caused to make great, right? Not I was great, but I caused to be great. Kach yomar ha'atiru ha'atir ve'etarti. And so that's why it's using this form of the Hebrew in this case. Devarim, your words. For Avlakulam, and he's saying the locus classicus, the best place to see what he's talking about, right? The example that he's using, that he for this conclusion is the Vehetartem alai divrechem. In Ezekiel chapter 35, it's talking here, it's clearly saying, you are all this praying you're doing to me, right? You have multiplied your words to me in prayer. Your beta, you made great, you waxed at length, right? So we know prayer is wonderful. We believe prayer is effective, but if the vessel from which that prayer comes is not pure, isn't doing what it's supposed to do, right? It goes along with following the mitzvot, acting with righteousness, etc. It's that element that then makes our prayers really effective. And it isn't just a matter of spending 3 hours or 5 hours or 10 hours praying. It's not the amount, it's the quality of what it comes from. Let's find the place here. Vayomer, and so he said, this is Pharaoh, said, Lemachar, tomorrow. That's when I want it done. Vayomer kidvarcha. And he said, Moses said to him, according to your word, just as you say. Lema'an teda. So here it is said quite explicitly, in order that you will know, ki, that ein kadoshem Elokeinu. There is nothing, no one like the Lord our God. So again, to draw human beings to this realization. And I think this is probably a good place. If any of you have any comments to make, and we'll save this with God's help, possibly for next year, assuming we're all around to do this.
Did you do the Rashi on that last one?
Oh, let's do the Rashi. Let's take a look.
Just a little one.
Okay. Yeah, here we go. Vayomer lemachar. This is Pharaoh saying tomorrow. Hitpalel hayom. Again, Rashi is emphasizing and underlying this understanding of what's going on here. Pray today, shi'ikartu lemachar, that they should be cut off tomorrow, that they should end, that this plague should come to an end tomorrow. So there's no more Rashi on that. So we will leave it here. I'm going to stop the share. Any thoughts? Any comments?
Yeah, I have a thought.
Yes.
If the magicians, if I was Pharaoh and my magicians can make the frogs, well, why can't I say, get rid of the frogs? I don't need Moses. You
That's
can do
such a wonderful question. Do you remember the Sorcerer's Apprentice?
What was that?
You remember the story about the Sorcerer's Apprentice?
No, I don't know. No, I don't remember.
A
I'm
wonderful
sorry.
piece of
There's
music.
a Mickey Mouse.
Yes, in Fantasia, correct. They did that based on
I
that.
don't see those movies. I'm sorry.
Dukas.
Yes, Paul Dukas. Sorcerer's Apprentice is in a way, talking about human progress when you don't really know what you're getting into. So, for example, COVID might be an example of the Sorcerer's Apprentice. So the sorcerer had this apprentice who was learning magic, right? But the sorcerer's apprentice had a job to do, which was to go to the well and bring water for the household. There was no plumbing, okay? So he had to do this. Well, the sorcerer's apprentice was able to use his sorcery to make a broom, okay, that would go and fetch the water for him so he didn't need to get it himself. And sure enough, the broom went and got the water. The problem happened when the when the apprentice, didn't know the spell to stop the broom from getting water. So the broom kept getting water and getting water and water. And then the apprentice tried to chop up the broom to prevent it from getting water. And every piece of wood that the broom got chopped into became another broom to get more and more and more water.
Oh my God.
And he couldn't stop it. So the whole place was getting flooded until the sorcerer showed up again. And this, of course, is a magnificent metaphor about human progress when you don't really know what you're getting into. Okay? But a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Like when they introduced rabbits in Australia. Okay.
Well, you mentioned like COVID, and it's kind of like the simple version of the huge, very resistant superbug that maybe was related to, or trying to get rid of every little thing with antibiotics and whatever. But there's a story, I think, in today's paper about how another really large sector of jobs are disappearing to AI, related to all different kinds of service, like paralegals and secretaries and things like that. And I mean, I can imagine, all kinds of writers or copywriters in the future, and it's just yeah, you do something, you discover penicillin, you discover a way to have a fast computation, but and all these good things came from it, but it's kind of then gets beyond you into something that's kind of degrades the fabric of society.
Cars.
Yeah. Right.
Cars, yep.
Energy, the use of energy. So again, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. But the other piece is, it's one thing to start something. It's also important to know how to stop something.
If I was Pharaoh, I would tell the Israelites, go ahead to pray 3 days ago. But I'll send my army with you to make sure you come back.
We're not going to write the story. David, you had a question, please. David?
Yeah, so I was just curious, I understand your point here, but is there anything in there that actually indicates that Pharaoh's sorcerers didn't know how to stop that, or is that just our conjecture around the whole thing, that they knew the spell to start it, they didn't know how to stop it? Yeah.
David, it's based on Harlan's wonderful question, which
okay.
wouldn't it have been logical for Pharaoh to have asked his magicians to do it. If the Torah says to us they were capable of creating the frogs, wouldn't Pharaoh be going to his own sorcerers? I mean, I think that's a legitimate concern.
But yeah, so
the fact that the Torah doesn't do that and makes Pharaoh, the Torah doesn't, I think that's part of the beauty of Torah study, is that it leaves us, to come up with these questions. If Harlan had not come up with that particular, that sense of discomfort that he had with the fact that Pharaoh comes to Moses, we wouldn't have been able to conclude all of this.
So basically, we're inferring it from
Yes.
yeah. That's all I was
think
asking.
It's a good inference. I'm
Yeah,
not saying it's a compelling inference, but it's a really good inference.
No,
it totally makes sense.
Well, I mean, a lot of this, has been, you've explained has been through inference, right? A lot of what, so okay. I was just curious if there was anything there beyond inference. Okay, you answered my question. Thank you.
So I will say this, David, we will see when it comes to the fleas, okay, or the lice, that the Egyptians are incapable. The magicians are incapable of doing it.
Right. I know they get they're confident.
We get to a point where the magicians can't do it anymore.
Right.
So if you think about it, it's all part of a process of believing in a divine power. Right.
Yeah.
What are the elements that might help a person recognize the fact that there really is a divine power?
Right. And yeah. And at what point does our ability basically run out so that you can no longer mask that, right? So that So okay, makes sense.
We'll also, of course, see that in the final analysis, there's nothing like stubbornness. Very, very little that you can do to overcome stubbornness, or dare I say, stupidity. So, all right.
Rabbi, in this Parsha, it seems like God has a plan. This was the whole plan that God wanted. So the whole world would see that God is God.
From the point of view of a story, absolutely. However, I think that it was always possible for Pharaoh to change his mind. But for the sake of this story is being told to us so that we understand ourselves better, because the Torah does want to see humanity go through a process of change so that this world can be a better world. So it's, we theologically, it would always have been possible for Pharaoh to say, you guys can go. You're right. I'm making a mistake. But then there wouldn't be a story. So we have to have it for the story. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording here.